Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pitts. Ukraine War News Update, first part thereof for the 4th of May 2024, and my goodness, am I not late to the party. I do apologise for bringing this news to you late. It's a weekend day. I had to pay for a ticket to go and see my son play football at a stadium. Whew, good old Havant at Waterlooville Stadium. Anyway, my boy, 13-year-old, he won. I've got two twin boys. One of them has just won the League Cup. Whoop-de-woo. 6-0 win. Again, that's a phenomenal win for a League Cup final. So awesome. Sonny Jim. Well done, Finn. Good stuff. Right, anyway, that's why I'm late to it. And it's going to be pretty similar tomorrow because he's got a rugby tournament tomorrow. Too much sport. Obviously not good for you. Not good for me. Have you missed me? Maybe not. Anyway, here are the statistics, the Ukrainian general staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before. All the usual caveats apply, of course. You can find them in the description to my video below. I keep promising to do Dell's stats, Dell and Bill's stats that you can find linked below. They have statistics that you can look at over time, particularly Dell's in terms of the graphs of the Ukrainian general staff figures. If I have time today, that's going to be my extra video, but it's going to be really challenging now because I have things to do and whatnot at home. Oh, real life gets in the way. Nonetheless, 1,260 personnel lost, and remember, these are all human beings. Like, despite them being, scare quotes, the enemy, being Russians, these are Russian people. Not all of them want to be there. Some of them do want to be there, but then the question is, why do they want to be there? Is it their fault that they are completely misinformed? Who do we blame in terms of 1,260 human beings being lost or injured, incapacitated over the last 24 hours? Well, I think we need to look at Mr. Putin and his cronies. Anyway, 1,260 is a really high number. We have now had over a week of over 1,000 personnel loss, which means that I think the Russians are really pushing and they are being heavily attrited and they are incurring some huge losses. That is obviously not good for them, although they are making progress. So it's that calculation that they deem as being worthwhile. 12 tanks lost in a day is pretty challenging. 27 APVs likewise. 46 pieces of artillery is a huge number, and they've lost a lot over the last week. I think the Ukrainians are really concentrating on trying to take out artillery pieces. We see 2 multiple launch rocket systems and 2 anti-aircraft warfare systems. So really consistently high numbers we've seen recently. Not in every category every day, but certainly personnel and then certain categories here and there. Well, here's another particularly high one. 71 vehicles and fuel tanks lost in a single day. Absolutely huge, and 8 pieces of special equipment. So those are high numbers for the Russians. The question is always, what are the Ukrainian losses? We just don't know, and I think it's just more difficult to guess. I'm figuring that the Ukrainians are going to be losing some pretty hefty personnel numbers in the Avdiivka direction and other directions. They are on a defensive. I think they will naturally be attriting fewer people. They will be losing to aviation, although we're hearing that 90% of their losses are coming, or injuries are coming from drones. So that's interesting. But my idea is that the Ukrainians will be set in trenches and tree lines and houses defending areas. The Russians have to attack where they are charging with vehicles and often on foot. And I just think it's much more likely that you'll get a higher attrition rate for the Russians than you do for the Ukrainians. And this is definitely being shown by the open source visually confirmed open source intelligence visually confirmed equipment losses. So it's probably unlikely you're going to get huge equipment differences. So the Russians are losing lots more equipment than the Ukrainians, as according to every single source that you can find. And so it would be kind of weird if that was the case, but the Ukrainians were losing exactly the same number of personnel or more personnel. So I don't think you can justify, at least rationally justify, the Ukrainians losing like a 1-to-1 in terms of personnel. I think you're going to see fewer Ukrainians, but the thing is, and the same with equipment, is that they can ill afford to lose even, I'd say, half the number of casualties than the Russians. So the Ukrainians really need to be looking after their people like they need to be looking after their equipment, of course. And so when I talk about the ratio needs to be 3-1 Russian to Ukrainian losses in equipment, it's going to need to be at least that in terms of personnel. And so a bad day for the Russians is 1,260 lost, but I'd assume a bad day for the Ukrainians would be 400 lost in that on the same day. So that's worth bearing in mind here. Right, this is, yes, we have 2 days of Andrew Perpetua's stats because I think we just missed out the one from yesterday, and he's just because I'm later today, we have, the last 24 hours, so 2 lots of stats to go through. You can see that the ratio is about right for the Ukrainians here, probably about 3-1, which is at least what they need. Let's look at the value. We've got an AN/TPQ-48 radar taken out, damaged by Lancet, so that's going to be a bit challenging for them. A multiple launch rocket system, BM-21 Grad, a couple of M777 launchers and a boat sunk. Those are all damaged. When we come down to the tanks, APCs, civilian vehicles, they're all pretty much destroyed, which is a little bit of a problem for the Ukrainians. The last 2 are unknown, so they could be on either side. Sometimes when you are surveying a battlefield or a road and that has been under the control of both sides, and there's just a charred out remains of a vehicle that both sides use. So BMP2 is something both sides use. SUVs is something both sides use. You just can't tell which side was actually driving it when it was blown up. So that's when Andrew lists them in purple. Okay, so that's, a radar lost, some kit, nothing like crazy valuable. Let's go to the Russians. They've lost here a destroyed book, another one. That would be the one I showed yesterday on the video that came out. We have a surveillance and comms piece of equipment, recovery vehicle, another Bren one. They're losing those quite a bit, the Russians. So they have an abandoned turtle tank with mine rollers. So one of those has been, we finally fallen by the wayside. I'm sure it's not the first one, actually, to be honest. T-62s, T-64s, T-72s, T-80s. Quite a lot of tanks on this list from yesterday. A few pieces of artillery. Infantry fighting vehicles. I think Andrew Perpetua said he's given some rationale, some reasoning as to why there is not as much footage for artillery, confirmation of artillery losses. I forget what the reason is. I mean, I've talked previously about counter-battery fire not always being carried out under the view of drones, spotted by drones. It's actually counter-battery that does that. So you have the radar or whatever it is that tracks the trajectory of the munition, and then you strike back and you take it out, and if it doesn't fire again, I presume you put it, ticking that one off as taken out. But I don't know. There's always a much bigger difference between the claimed artillery system losses and the visually confirmed. The armored personnel vehicles and the tanks are far more frequently shown on lists like this. Anyway, infantry fighting vehicles, a number of those, they're APCs, trucks, ATVs, so things like the golf carts and then quads, as well as civilian vehicles. And quite a few in the IFV and tank categories destroyed there, most of them. So those are, or abandoned, those are pretty significant losses for the Russians, although the Ukrainians did lose that radar. Russians lost that book. So I think the Russians having a worse day in those stats. And then when we look at today's stats, these, just making sure these are actually different. Yes, so here we have another 2 unknown at the bottom. This is more like a 2-to-1 loss ratio. So that's not quite good enough for the Ukrainians, even though just on paper, without any other knowledge of this conflict, you think, well, if the other side were losing twice as many vehicles as we, then that's got to be good for us type thing. But actually, that isn't quite good enough. And when we look at the Ukrainian equipment lost and old bits of artillery, the older sort of Soviet-era artillery there, comms tower, surveillance camera, a couple of tanks, a Marder damaged, Iveco APC damaged, destroyed, a few other bits and pieces, nothing particularly high value. Again, Lancets popping up a little bit more often than I would like. So, yeah. And then when we go on to the Russians, looking at the Ukrainians, I'd say that's just maybe 50-50 damage versus destroyed. When we look at the Russians, I'd say that statistic is slightly more damaged than destroyed. So that's something that the Ukrainians would prefer is of all these listings, they have more destroyed of the Russians and the Ukrainians. Air defense, a Tor system damaged. I'm not sure I would have put that to pretty much destroyed. Well, you can't tell actually, but if we go and look at that, I'll bring that one up now. So this is the Tor. So make sure that is not got music. So there's the Tor, and then the Gimlers lands right on top of it. So not only do you have the destructive power of the munition itself, but then you've got quite a bit of shrapnel going on and all sorts. So, I mean, it's hard to know exactly what has happened to that, which is why I think Andrew's put here damage is likely severe. So I would be very surprised if that is recoverable in any significant amount. So that's a Tor air defense system, fairly high value there. We've got a Strij electronic warfare, a couple more recovery vehicles. Again, Russians losing them quite a lot. And then I talked the other day about how you are starting to see a lot more older howitzers, D20s and 30s. These are really old bits of kit, right? And they're being drawn from stockpiles because they are running out of self-propelled howitzers. So ideally, the Russians would be wanting to use mainly self-propelled howitzers if they could, because they can shoot and scoot, and they're certainly newer than these howitzers. Now, that they're not, and that here we have 100% artillery loss of older towed howitzers should tell us a story. And it's kind of what I've been saying, which is we're seeing a lot more of these older howitzers. Those stockpiles are being drawn from. Why are they being drawn from? Because they're running out of kit on the front line, so they're dipping into their stockpiles, but then they're having to dip into their older stockpiles. They've gone through, but arguably gone through their self-propelled guns first. So they did that through the first couple of years of the war, and now we're starting to see towed howitzers turn up much more frequently on the front line. Not always, and the last time I talked about this, it was a day when they didn't have any, but there are some days where the lists are full of these older howitzers, and I just think it is a reflection of the difficulties that Russia are having. And these will have these will have older barrels that are no doubt in a much shadier condition than a newly manufactured piece of kit. That will have an effect on the range and have effect on the accuracy of these things. So then they have to bring them further forward, and that makes them even more vulnerable, and so they are hit more often, and it's a bit of a sort of vicious cycle for the Russians there. And that is the good news for the Ukrainians, is that when they're getting provided kit from the West, it is, some of it is older kit, older Western kit, but it is generally, in comparison to the Russian kit, in a better nick or better type of kit, and so they don't have to bring them as far forward, and it keeps them a little bit safer. Anyway, tanks here, we have a range of tanks and mine rollers on some of them, which shows that they are being used in attacks. Infantry fighting vehicles, BMP 1s, 2s and 3s, BTRs, and then a whole list of other stuff. You've got some golf carts and whatnot. So I'd say that is definitely a worse, even though it's 2-1, I think it is worse for the Russians than for the Ukrainians, but the Ukrainians would definitely like the ratio to be higher than 2-1. Interesting that the Ukrainians have quite a bit of artillery on there. It could well be that, so 5 of those are Lancets, and that's likely that some units drop some Lancet footage there. But it may not be. But it interesting that, or they're just using a lot more Lancets. I think they have ramped up the production of those, and the Russians are using them effectively. Right. Interesting that the French said yesterday and the day before, was it yesterday? I think 150,000 dead is what they said, killed in action of the Russians. That's a really interesting figure, because it's broadly in line with what the Ukrainians say, and it's kind of like the higher end of the range. And if that's what the French are officially saying, then that's interesting. Here now they're saying 500,000 casualties. So according to Ukrainian military estimates, Russia has lost over 470,000. France is saying that the Russians have lost 500,000. So they're now going over what the Ukrainian general staff figures are saying. I find this quite interesting. Oh, what are you doing, Pierce? I find this quite interesting because it's on the one hand, it confirms what the Ukrainian General Staff figures, Ukrainian General Staff is saying, and that gives us justification for believing that. So the French military intelligence are believing that, then, and they're going to be in a better situation than us. Then we're probably quite well justified in believing ourselves. The counter argument would be, well, are the French playing some kind of psyops argument here? I don't know what the benefit for them doing that would be. Why would they bother bringing that out? So there could be that. The other thing I will say, and this is interesting because, you know, the French saying 150,000 killed during the full-scale invasion, and Stéphane Séjourné, the French foreign minister, said, all this for what? This can be summed up with two words: for nothing. And then we have the UK intelligence now coming out today and estimating 465,000 Russian casualties so far, which is a staggering figure, and that is in line pretty much exactly with what the Ukrainian General Staff figures are. So this is slightly less than the French, but at the upper end of the scale as well. I mean, we always assume that the Ukrainian General Staff figures are the top end of the scale for like PR and, you know, propaganda, psyops, all that kind of stuff. But actually, we've got the French saying, no, we think it's more. And we've got the British saying, yeah, that's pretty much spot on. The Russians are generating soldiers, but losing them at an astounding clip, says Phillips O'Brien. The disregard of the Russian leadership for their own people is one reason Ukraine must win. So let's just see what the British intelligence have said. So the average daily number of Russian casualties killed and wounded in Ukraine throughout April 2024 remained in the pattern of 2024 with 899 losses per day. It's likely that the Russian casualty rate will again increase over the next 2 months as they renew dedicated offensive operations in eastern Ukraine. This follows a slight decrease in the pace of operations over the past 2 months since the fall of Avdiivka. The total number, I think it's ticking up now as reflected by those numbers, and this is what they're kind of saying. The total number of Russian losses since the start of the conflict now stands at over 465,000. It's likely that despite the extreme cost in life, Russia has fully adapted its military to attritional warfare, which relies on mass over quality. This reliance on mass will almost certainly continue for the duration of the Ukraine war and will have long-lasting effects on Russia's future army. Now, what I was going to say, so that's what those claims are. The kind of caveat to apply here is that, and I, you know, from a pro-Ukrainian point of view, I would like this to be true. We've got the Ukrainians claiming it, the French confirming it, and the British confirming it. But the British and French are almost certainly going to be, in some large parts, relying on the Ukrainian stats for their stats. The British and French do not have people on the ground up and down Ukraine with binoculars and a dictaphone going, yeah, there's another 10 there, yeah, there's another 15 there. When they're going to be looking at the data, they are going to have broadly this access to the same data that actually most of us do. So people like Andrew Perpetua and his team are scouring the open source sources for evidence to compile their databases. Well, that's broadly what the UK intelligence and the French intelligence are going to be doing, although they might have access to slightly more satellite imagery and better satellite imagery that is not released onto the socials. But to some large extent, they will be reliant on the Ukrainian General Staff. And the question is, what are they doing to check the reliability of the Ukrainian General Staff figures? I'm sure that that's a key component here. And I assume that they'll be crossing the T's and dotting the I's and won't release stuff like this if they think it's dubious statistics, unless this plays an important psyops propaganda role for the UK intelligence and the French intelligence. So there's lots of stuff going on here, but I think on balance, we are justified again in believing the Ukrainian General Staff figures rather than not. Gee whiz, rather than not. And I think that is, I think that's good news, to be quite frank. So, I've spent a couple of years going over these figures and piecing these jigsaw pieces together to make this picture that I think is a broad justification of what Ukraine are saying. Certainly, what we are more justified in believing the Ukrainians than the Russian stats and claims. Now, here is, I know it's just another anecdote, but something worth dipping into. This is a Russian commander's motivational speech to soldiers that he's giving. And it starts off with this. And look at all those Russian soldiers along there. We've got your Russian commander here. All of you will die. Woohoo! Hey, I feel good about myself. I'm really motivated. Let's do this. Should we do this? Yeah, let's do this. What are we doing? We're going to die. Just whatever it is, we're all going to die. Oh, really? I used to work as a lifeguard at a local swimming pool, and it's kind of nice doing that. I'm going to die. Like, definitely? Yeah. All of you will die, but know one thing, he says. Mother Russia will never forget us. Flowers will be brought to all of our headstones for centuries. Well, that's worth it then. Every warrior's name will be carved into memorial plaques. Yeah, but will they? I mean, just to let you know, I have seen, over the course of this war, maybe over 1,000 bodies lying uncollected. But every warrior's name will be carved into memorial plaques. Of course there will be. Of course there will be. Sorry. I didn't mean to doubt you, Mr. Russia there. You carry on talking about your mother. Mother Russia. Eternal flames will be lit for all of us. Yeah. Okay. That's thoroughly motivational. So here we have someone who's been one of those people lined up there, no doubt. Literally Cargo 200. An everyday tale of being a soldier in Russia's army. So what's going on here? Dmitry from War Translated says, this Russian serviceman of the 200th Brigade, 3rd Battalion, informs his family about the intention of the command of the brigade to, quote, nullify, which is to shoot him and his colleague with the call sign Kalmyk. According to this soldier, executions of their soldiers in the 200th Brigade are a common practice, and the bodies of those executed are simply abandoned in positions or buried in the marshes. Wow. Incredible. Anyway, so there you go. So that is a Russian claiming that is the case. So executions are not uncommon in the Russian army. Conrad Muzika here saying that, Conrad, 90% of the wounded that come through here, stabilization point, are targeted either by FPV or drone dropped munitions. So that's Chaziv Yar, and that is, it is a real challenge for the Ukrainians as well as the Russians. I mean, we're seeing this on both sides. The footage is so widespread, and goodness me, yeah, it's going to be interesting to, I don't know if we'll ever know the statistics through the course of this war, but it started out in this war as we would have expected. The artillery was a big killer of about 88% of all troops getting taken out, killed or injured, and sort of 8% snipers and a few percent other things. Now, especially with the lack of artillery ammunition, you're going for the Ukrainians and actually for the Russians as well. So the Russians, though they have a 5-1 advantage or more, and they are firing 10,000 a day compared to the Ukrainians 2,000 a day or somewhere around that, that 10,000 a day is up to a sixth of what, or down to a sixth of what they may have been firing at the peak of the war. So artillery is not being used as much by either side, and FPV drones and drone drop munitions are being utilized loads and loads, and so including things like the Baba Yaga octocopters for the Ukrainians, dropping multiple munitions, almost doing bombing raids, and then they can work together in sort of fleets of these Baba Yagas, just taking out Russian positions completely and stopping Russian attacks. We'll come on to that in a second. But of course, the Russians are doing that to the Ukrainians too. The question is, what's the difference between the two? Here we got equipment losses from the Battle of Krinky coming out again. And the latest is confirmed losses, 57 Ukrainian losses against 244 Russian losses. So that's about just under a 1-to-5 ratio. So the Russians are losing sort of 5 times as many pieces of equipment around Krinky as the Ukrainians. What else do we have here? No, I did see one come out as well for the Avdiivka area, which is something like 172 for the Ukrainians and 1,100, something like that for the Russians. So the losses around Avdiivka are even higher in terms of that ratio. Really, really problematic ratio for the Russians there. And this is visually confirmed. This isn't like people pulling stuff out their backsides. This isn't propaganda. This is open source intelligence, visually confirmed, and you can go and check the data. Tatargami here says, while Russia remains a serious battlefield threat, so this is not to knock the Russians as alike. They will have elements that are really good at fighting. They will have well-equipped units. They will have well-trained units. They will have units that use the right maneuvers and tactics, right? So it's not like this is reflective of everything about the Russian army. However, when you see pictures like this, you're left thinking, why is this the case? So while Russia remains a serious battlefield threat, their ability to replace lost armoured vehicles is limited. A vivid example is the motorcycle abandoned during the assault on the Belahorivka area, where a pallet was used as a sidecar to transport assault infantry. So like you are using a motorbike and a sidecar to transport Russian infantry to the contact zone, contact line, or whatever, and you are having to sit them on pallets on a sidecar. Like, this is definitely suboptimal. Now, it can still do a job, right? And it might be a good stopgap, but if you're having to rely on this, it just speaks to a little bit of desperation. It's same with those turtle tanks. They do a job, but if you're being forced to put corrugated iron, if you're forced to put drone cages made out of bed springs around things, rather than having it bespoke made in a defense manufacturing plant to a proper level that will withstand drones. And it might be, as I say, that it's an effective stopgap, but it's just suboptimal, isn't it? And it just means that I think the Russians are running low on the kind of vehicles that they should be using. I've already shown you that tour getting blown up by the HIMARS. Here we have really interesting bit of footage of a Russian attack involving a tank at the front, a Russian tank and 2 IFVs behind, and then a Ukrainian tank is coming from basically bottom right of this image, Ukrainian tank in the middle there driving up the road, and it blows up. It has a tank-on-tank attack, blows up the Russian tank, destroys it, and puts an end to that Russian attack, which is interesting. You can go and watch these are linked below. I can't play them to you. Andrew Perpetua talks about this video that Konstantin's put out. So this video has a lot going for it. The drone taking out the BMP-2 is fun. It's geolocated, by the way, but the end where the Mavic drone pretty much ends a Russian assault is clutch. Drones are vitally important on defense, recon drones especially, but also FPV and dive bombers. So I've seen some dive bomber drones footage recently, lots of FPV footage, of course, and also drone dropping bombs. Some of these Mavics are able to carry slightly better, larger munitions rather than like a single smaller hand grenade. And of course, like I've said, the Baba Yagas can carry like 8 grenades or whatever, larger munitions. This video is interesting because yet again we are seeing evidence of drones being used, and I can't speak for this not being the case with the Russians as well, but the drones are being used in sort of like maneuvers. So there are several clips of this drone footage where you've got Ukrainian troops fighting in a trench and Russian troops over there, and the Ukrainian troops are using the drones to drop munitions on the Russian troops in the same trench line, just around the corner a bit, and then they can come around and finish them off and stuff. So it's the use of drones in combination with troops. It's not just like we have no troops there, we're just sending some drones to drop some stuff on Russians. It's like we are doing a defensive maneuver, the Russians are attacking our trenches, and we're going to use drones to both do recce to let our troops know where the Russians are. Because imagine fighting, you got smoke and things exploding, and the noise, your vision might be impaired, and you are panicking, you've got adrenaline pumping. You don't know where the Russians are. You've got zigzag trench. You might not even know exactly the shape of the trench going forward. If you're being told in your ear, oh, by the way, you've got 2 guys just down there to the right. You need to be careful. One of our guys is going to come and drop an IED on their heads. Then that really helps, and that kind of coordination is super important. And it's videos like that to show that is happening. I think in terms of where warfare is going, drones are obviously super important for combined arms maneuvers, where drones before this war wouldn't have been thought of in terms of using them for combined arms. It'd be like, how are we going to use the aviation, the infantry and artillery and mortar teams and blah blah blah. Now drones are just going to be a central component of both defensive and offensive maneuvers. For the Russians here, we have the footage being released by Russian sources of what appears to be the fifth loss of an M1A1 SA Abrams main battle tank. I thought there had been 5 lost already, but anyway, by the Ukrainian armed forces, with this loss claimed to have occurred in the Donetsk region. Now we have this it makes me kind of laugh and then go, oh, yeah. We captured NATO equipment with the losses of 450,000 dead of our sons. The true definition of Russians. Anyway, congratulations to them, says Getty here. Right, what is this about? So, we've got May the 9th coming up in the, I believe this is Red Square. They've got a line of captured or damaged Ukrainian but Western equipment that Ukrainians have been using. They've lined this up and they're having big crowds come and visit them and take pictures, and it's all part of a PR thing. That's not to say there isn't a place for this. Like, the Ukrainians have done this, but they did it in a slightly different way. The way the Ukrainians have shown their blown up Russian tanks is a kind of like, this is a sign of our resistance. It's like, we're the underdogs, we're resisting the superpower. This is a bit more pathetic because we're a superpower, but we're also kind of admitting that the Western equipment is better than ours, because we're going to put it on show to say, oh, look what we've got. As it almost assumes that this is better than the Russian stuff. So everyone crowds around and goes, oh, look, we got all, can I touch it? And then this old man going, yeah, why, damn you, you pesky Americans. And it's I don't know, it's just a little bit pathetic, but especially when you know the reality that the Russians have lost phenomenal amounts of equipment in exchange for these. And so that if these people knew the ratio, I don't know. If they really, truly knew the ratio, I don't think they'll be out doing this. I think they'll be embarrassed. But I'm not saying that, there isn't a place for this kind of thing. But I just think the reality really shows that it's not so cool for the Russians. Okay, UK intelligence has also said the other day that the Ukrainian attack on Krasnodar Krai air base has forced the dispersal of Russian aircraft, boosting operational burdens. So this was due to a drone attack about a week ago now on Krasnodar Krai, which is on the other side of the Kerch Bridge and sort of down a little bit. It's that neck of the woods. So the UK intelligence wrote, and I'll read that out from the original. Over the course of the week, Ukrainian attack on the Russian airfield has likely contributed to approximately 40 aircraft of different types being removed from the area and dispersed to multiple airfields further from the front line. The impact of this is unlikely to be immediately obvious or dramatic. However, Ukraine has already demonstrated the ability to strike much further into Russia than these dispersal locations. Forcing such dispersal measures means the length of sorties will have to increase to maintain the same permanency over the battle space. This will in turn require more fuel, increasing cost, while also placing more strain on the aircrews and indeed the airframes. So you have a certain amount of flight hours for airframes before basically you need to get a new plane. Now, both the Ukrainians and the Russians are going to be extending those on, I think, a lot of their airframes. Although the Russians have a lot of airframes compared to the Ukrainians, it's not ideal. You have to fly further, put them under greater stress. There's also a greater percentage chance of something going wrong the longer you're flying, and you're using up more fuel, and you can spend less time in the places where you need to if you're providing things like close air support or whatever. I don't know. Point being that forcing the Russians to change their behavior by these strikes is not always about destroying as many airframes as possible, although that's great, but it's about changing the behavior of the Russian airframes, like we've seen with the Black Sea Fleet in the Black Sea, making them go to Novorossiysk, meaning that they have to travel further. They're not so effective. They don't send them out on, if you like, sorties so much. And that is a success for the Ukrainians. It might not be sinking those ships, but it's about changing where they are based and how they are used. Okay, a little bit of Russia on fire here. Deep into the afternoon in the far eastern city of Khabarovsk, a shopping mall has denazified itself. 270 people evacuated. I mean, that is a big old fire. These things seem to happen. Like I've said to you before, the reason I show these, and you think, well, what's that got to do with the war? It might be that that's an insurance job. It might be it's sabotage. It might just be a careless smoker and a mistake. But my goodness, if that fire happened in the UK, that would be like our big annual fire. Like, I can't believe that's happened. That's mental. These are happening like every week in Russia. I mean, I've already shown you statistical analyses of the amount of fires, the anomalous nature of the fires, and the size of the fires being much bigger than they used to be. So even the Russians admit this, because actually one of the analyses I showed you some time back, and this was going back a year, I think now, was a rebar analysis of the statistics showing that, yeah, fires aren't cool and they are a problem. Anyway, let's move on. So relatively quiet night in terms of strikes. I don't think the Ukrainians did any strikes. The Russians hit Ukraine with 13 drones. All of them were shot down. They also fired 4 S-300 guided anti-aircraft guided missiles, which were not intercepted, and they were carried out from Belgorod. So they did hit Kharkiv, and Kharkiv has been on fire. Is pretty horrible there for the Ukrainian fire services. Some huge fires caused by Russian night drone and missile attacks last night. Russia is currently on track to manufacture at least 10,000 Shahed drones per year, enabling routine strikes to maintain pressure on Ukraine's air defense, although I think it's likely that's going to be S-300s doing more of the damage. The Russians did, I say the Ukrainians didn't fire any missiles. The Russians claimed that they shot down 4 ATACMS going into Crimea last night. Then Ocean Defender says, despite these claims, there were no explosions or air defense activity reported last night in Crimea. That was the initial claim. So we quite often hear these, and it's quite often that these are just outright lies from the Russians. But when you do hear them, it's probably more likely that there was at least some missile activity. And they often say we shot them down, and then later you find out that, no, you didn't shoot them down. Well, no reports has later come out and said a large-scale fire can be seen in occupied Crimea near the village of Luhove, northeast of Yevpatoria. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed a total of 4 ATACMS were shot down over the peninsula overnight. Taking a look at the 24-hour time frame, the fire was initially even bigger. So these are FIRMS fires here. So FIRMS is the NASA satellite imagery that comes out to show where there are basically big fires, and it was originally designed and implemented to look for wildfires around the world, but it's actually been really useful for finding out where activity is taking place in this war of significance. And that is significant. So that does not look like an ATACMS being shot out of the sky. That looks like multiple fires over quite a time period, which would suggest a successful strike on multiple things that are burning. Because each one of these, like you would expect, my opinion, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if you had a single ATACMS, like a unitary warhead that hit a single place, you'd get something like that. Or maybe if the fire spread, you might get something like this. But this looks very much like and if you shot something down, well, you're unlikely to have this unless it hits residential kind of area, or like a well built up area, like we've seen in places like Odessa and Kharkiv, where they shoot down drones, or any kind of Ukrainian city where they've shot down drones, and you get fires that can result. This is a shot down missile. It could be that is the case, but that looks rather like a successful strike to me, but we just don't know at the moment. Right, Dara Masako, who's always worth paying attention to, says Ukraine recently hit a Russian training site with ATACMS. I showed you that the other day. Russia says it destroyed HIMARS launchers that were moving into concealed positions. I showed you that the other day, although it's unlikely that both were HIMARS. One was, I think, a truck, and the other one might not have been a HIMARS. It could have been a number of different things. So there are some caveats to apply to that, but they were moving into concealed positions. Russian reconnaissance strikes have been getting faster and more lethal in the last few months and will require TTP changes. TTP, by the way, is tactics, techniques, and procedures, so specific methods and strategies used by military forces to accomplish their objectives in various operational environments. So, okay, they're going to have to change the way they do things. I'll show you what I see, says Dara Masako. So, Recently, Ukraine hit a training area in Luhansk with ATACMS. The article in the first tweet of the thread lays this out. The goal was to neutralize a force grouping. The strike was successful. Only half of these missiles hit their marks. Extra are used to ensure hits, but still, so I was talking about, not really sure about whether what was going on here, because the first one was a dud, and then one of them definitely seemed to hit the troops. And two others were hitting like a little bit way off. So one ATACM missed a fixed command post, jamming in coordinates slightly off. Two ATACMs hit a force grouping R, so she's got two of them, and probably another vehicle or CP bivouac in the trees. Today, Russian military shows a video of a drone tracking a HIMARS moving into a concealed position, and then what looks to be an Iskander strike at the same area. Results of the strike are unclear, as are the location, date, and time. But, I mean, some people say that it might have been Tornado S, but whatever. This video shows Russia's ability to detect high-value Ukrainian targets with drones. This is definitely true. And call in precision strikes, which is true, on a fleeting target that stays in place for a very short period of time. Russian social media says 40 kilometers from the front line of contact. Additional verification is needed to determine the outcome of this strike. If Russia is able to successfully destroy these launches, it means that their strike loop is within the amount of time it takes for these ATACMS launches. Adjustments in the Ukrainian TTPs are essential if true. And we have seen an increasing number of successful strikes by Russians on time-sensitive targets. This is definitely true. If verified it to be true with imagery that the launches were destroyed, it would mean that Ukraine lost something very valuable in exchange for what looks like a company-sized regeneration site. If false, still means Russia tracks these assets in real time at longer distances. I mean, it depends whether those were the launches for that strike, but nonetheless, kind of two sides of a square, really. Some Russian drone-enabled HVT fleeting target strikes are now approaching 100 kilometers behind the LOC, so behind the front lines. This is part of a pattern of Russia's recon strike improving over time at longer distances, and Ukraine has been losing assets as a result. So we have seen things like Patriot launches be lost, claims of NASAMS, but I don't think most of those have stood up to analysis. But nonetheless, there's still targets that look like that. And another day could be that. So this is definitely challenging for the Ukrainians. With the supplements ammo arriving, I assume an uptick in ATACMS strikes. I also advise being prepared for Russian targeting of the launchers and other dynamic HVTs like air defense to accelerate. This high-value targets, by the way, HVTs. This is why longer-range ATACMS and continued use of HVT decoys are key. Decoys are actually surprisingly important these days. And then finally, Russia struck the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv. Oh, sorry, that should have been earlier. There's some more fires and more bad stuff happening in Kharkiv. Okay, moving on to other bits and pieces. No, stop, bugger off with that. Right, okay, Ukraine will be able to stabilize. Let's get rid of that once and for all. Ukraine will be able to stabilize the situation at the front no earlier than the second half of 2024, according to New York Times. So that's interesting. That's to say that the Ukrainians are in for a really tough couple of months. The Russians are going to be throwing stuff at the Ukrainians. Then, of course, there's this theory that they're not throwing everything at the Ukrainians at the moment. They are building up forces of equipment and personnel ready for a larger push somewhere in the summer. And if that's the case, then the Ukrainians, as it says here, will be able to stabilize only in the second half of 2024. So that's July onwards, just in case you don't know how the months of the year work. The situation on the battlefield will not stabilize as quickly as we would like, because sending large volumes of weapons will take a long time. So even though there are these big aid packages coming in from the US, from Germany, from the UK, from France, from Italy, etc., and from the Baltics and Nordics, these will take time. You know, Australians have got stuff coming over, and of course they've got to put it on the back of a kangaroo and put the kangaroo on a boat, and a boat has to go to Africa, load it on a camel, that has to get up to Ukraine. So these things take a lot of time. Okay, another war crime in occupied territories has been alleged by Ukraine's head of Luhansk region. I've been spending a lot of time arguing with my mate Tom Williamson, not with him, but with his friend on Facebook. It's on a private thread, so don't go looking for it. Just amazes me that people can get sucked into full-on Russian propaganda. He's a clever guy. I think he might be a left-leaning guy who would be like, he's of the sort that I previously would have been, which is kind of anti-American imperialism, blah, 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 blah. and then saying, well, both sides, I hate the Russians and Ukraine are corrupt. It's like, oh, that justifies being invaded. And I think it's really important, like words make a difference. So Ukraine has a problem with corruption is how I would phrase it. Ukraine is corrupt is how Russians would phrase it. And actually there's quite a big difference there. Having a problem with corruption doesn't mean you are completely endemically corrupted throughout the nation in the same way that Somalia is, right? At the bottom of the Transparency International Corruption Index. That is a corrupt nation, and you can safely say that. I think saying Ukraine is corrupt is something that you would expect a Russian to say. And so when someone is using this as justification for, almost not quite justification for being invaded, but for total appeasement. So this guy's like claiming that it's Ukraine's fault for not doing a peace deal at the beginning of the war, because, you know, when you invaded, the first thing you should think is, yeah, take everything. Let's have peace. Take everything. Because, of course, that's what you do if someone came into your house. Yeah, help yourself. Yeah, anything to just have peace. Help yourself. Just take anything in the house, of course. And this guy's just, all the arguments he's used, all of them were like massive pro-Russian propaganda points, to the point that he was using a guy called Kachanovsky, who's a Canadian Ukrainian, but he's a pro-Russian Canadian, who's blamed like Euromaidan shooting as a false flag on the Ukrainians, and it's who the Russians use to argue. And he's like bringing out articles by this guy. I'm like, oh god, here we go, right? So it's bullshit asymmetry. I have to put in lots more time than you in trying to debunk what you're claiming, but it's really frustrating. What you want to just say to people like this is, do you know what? Just look at who's committing the war crimes. Another war crime in occupied territories. Artem Lysahor posted that Russia is threatening to take away newborns and mothers if neither parent has taken a Russian passport. There's no evidence for this claim. So, okay, first of all, this could be just hearsay, psyops, whatever. But what we do know is that Russia has definitely committed war crimes to do with passporting and not giving access to services unless people in occupied territories take on a Russian passport. So this is, while we can't confirm this claim that the Russians are threatening to take newborns from mothers if neither parent has taken a Russian passport. They have done definitely things like this. These have been registered war crimes already. It's so much to do with nationality, you know, being forced to naturalize as a Russian, etc., etc. And just when you're arguing with people who are taking the Russian side, it's like, have you seen the breadth of the things that the Russians have been doing? Absolutely terrible. Anyway, that's enough from me. Thanks for watching. Take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.